Chapter 7. The Removal. I awoke the children when day broke, as I wished to give them some directions about our emigration. "We are going," I said, "to a part of the country which is new to us. See that none of you wander away alone. You may get into danger as well by going on before as by lingering behind. Keep as much as possible all together, and if we meet an enemy, let me direct the attack or the defense." Prayers and breakfast over, we prepared to depart. The cavalcade was assembled. The ass and the cow carried the bags my wife had made, filled with a number of indispensables. We took care not to forget the captain's stock of wine and a barrel of butter. As I was going to load the animals with our hammocks and blankets, my wife interposed and claimed a place for little Frances and for the sack she called her magic bag. Then she showed me the absolute necessity of taking with us the fowls and pigeons, which, if they were left behind, would be scattered and lost. I saw she was right. A comfortable seat was found for Francis on the ass's back between the two bags, with his mother's magic bag to lean his back upon. We had still to get hold of our fowls and pigeons. The children set off to chase them, but returned unsuccessful and were persuaded by their mother to remain where they were, while she undertook the capture of the startled birds. "We shall see," cried the little blunderers. "You shall see," replied their mother. By means of a handful of corn scattered on the ground, the birds were tempted within the tent, where they were easily caught. "Skill works better than violence, you see, gentlemen," said she, closing the entrance to our tent, through which Jack crept, and handed us one by one our feathered prisoners, whose feet we bound and then placed them upon the back of the cow. This done, we covered them with a cloth, and thus, plunged in darkness, they ceased to annoy us by their cries. All the things that we left that could have suffered from exposure were laid up in the tent, which was well barricaded with stakes and boxes, both full and empty. We were all well armed, and each carried a bag for provisions and ammunition. Every one seemed in good spirits. Fritz, with his gun under his arm, marched first. Behind him, his mother drove the ass and cow side by side. On the ass rode little Francis, amusing us all by his simple remarks. Third from the front came Jack with the goat. Fourthly, Ernest with the sheep, while I myself brought up the rear. Our dogs kept running here and there, barking and scenting. This caravan moved along slowly and was really quite picturesque, so much so indeed that I could not help calling to my eldest son, "Well, Fritz, here is your idea carried out, for something after this fashion Abraham must have travelled. How do you like it, my little patriarch?" Ernest answered for his brother, "I, Papa, think it is delightful." "True," said I, "but it is not God's will that we should long be reduced to wander about like this. You would soon tire of it, and I trust this may be our last pilgrimage." "So do I," said my wife. "I hope that our new abode will please us and that we shall be able to remain in it. If not, the responsibility is mine." "Wherever you lead," replied I, "we shall be willing to follow." As we approached the bridge, the pig, which had at first appeared very loath to accompany us, now joined the procession, grunting loud remonstrances against this long walk. But its ill humor did not meet with much sympathy from the rest of the party. The passage of the stream was effected without accident, but the luxuriant vegetation on the other side did not fail to retard our march considerably. The rich grass, such as they had never before seen, was a temptation too great to be resisted by our cow and ass. It was only by the aid of our dogs, who barked and snapped at their heels, that we could get them to move on. To avoid such hindrances in future, I changed our course, going with the stream towards the sea, hoping to reach the well-known road by the shore, where there was nothing to impede our progress. We had scarcely started in that direction when our dogs bounded into the thick grass, growling as if they were on the track of some fierce animal. Fritz, with his gun loaded and his finger on the trigger, advanced resolutely. Ernest, terrified, drew near his mother, having at the same time loaded his gun. Jack courageously followed his elder brother, and I hurried to his assistance, lest he should run into danger. Suddenly I heard him cry, "Oh, Papa, come quick! A porcupine! A monster porcupine!" I quickened my steps and soon came in sight of the porcupine, which, however, was not so large as Jack had led me to believe. The dogs barked furiously round the animal which they could not attack without paying dearly for it. The porcupine turned his back to his enemies, lowered his head between his two forepaws, and marched backwards, his bristles erect like so many swords. Every time the dogs attempted to charge, they came off bleeding and wounded. Fritz and I were watching for the moment when we might fire without injuring the dogs. Jack, all impatience and not understanding our hesitation, discharged one of his pistols and killed the porcupine on the spot. Fritz, a little spiteful at his brother's success, said hastily, "Imprudent boy, you might have killed the dogs or wounded us in firing so near." "Wound you indeed," repeated Jack proudly. "Do you think no one can manage a gun but yourself?" Seeing that Fritz was going to reply, I hastened to interfere. "It is true," I said to my eldest son, "that Jack might have acted more prudently, but you must admit that he has shown great skill. You must learn to praise others when they deserve it." Jack, meanwhile, without thinking, had laid hold of the animal with his hands and was severely wounded. "Go and get a rope," I said to him, "and Fritz and you can carry it with the help of a stick between you." But impatient to show his prize to his mother and brothers, Jack tied his handkerchief round the animal's neck and drew it after him to the place where we had left the caravan. "See, Mamma," he cried. "See, Ernest, see, Francis, the great animal I have killed. Yes, I killed it. I was not afraid of 100,000 lances. I went up to it and killed it with one shot, and it is excellent eating. Papa says so." His mother congratulated him on his courage and skill. Ernest examined the animal in his usual cool manner, observing that he had in each jaw 2 long incisors like those of the hare and squirrel, and that his ears were short and rounded like a man's. My wife and I sat down and began pulling out the bristles from the muzzles of our dogs. "Jack," said I, "were you not afraid that the porcupine would send its quills into your body? It is said the animal has that power." "I never thought of it," he replied, "but I think that statement must be a fable. You see, however," said I, "that the dogs have not been spared." "It is true," he answered, "but they threw themselves on the animal. If they had kept at a distance, they would not have been hurt." "You are right, my son," I said, "and I am glad to see you can defend your opinions. The porcupine has not the power of shooting out its quills. His losing some in a fight has probably given rise to the story." Determined to carry home the porcupine, I covered him with a thick coat of grass, rolled him in a cover, and placed him on the ass behind Francis. We had not gone far, however, when the ass escaped from my wife, who held the bridle, and ran on before us, jumping and cutting a number of grotesque capers that would have amused us very much had we not all feared for Francis. Fritz ran after him, and aided by the dogs, soon got the better of him. Searching for the cause of this sudden change in the conduct of the usual quiet animal, I found that the bristles of the porcupine had come through the grass and covering in which he was wrapped. So I placed the carcass on the enchanted bag and counseled Francis not to lean upon it. Fritz kept at some distance from the caravan, doubtless with the intention of taking his revenge if an occasion presented itself. "Wonderful!" exclaimed Ernest when he saw the large trees we were approaching. "What gigantic vegetation! The steeple of Strasbourg is not higher. How luxuriant nature is here! It was a good idea of Mamma's to leave the desolate country in which we were for a place like this." He asked me if I knew the name of the trees. "I have never seen them described, and we are probably the first Europeans who have seen them," said I. "But I defy the most agile bear to reach us at the top of these enormous trunks when we shall have succeeded in establishing ourselves there." "Well," said my wife, "what do you think of our trees?" "I understand your admiration and approve of your choice," said I. When we halted, our first care was to unload the ass and cow, which, with the sheep and goats, we allowed to graze round us, taking the precaution, however, to shackle their forelegs. The sow only was allowed perfect freedom. We also set the fowls and pigeons at liberty. The fowls kept near us, scraping and picking up what they could get. The pigeons perched themselves on the branches of the trees, from which elevation, however, they descended when the first handful of corn was thrown down. While we rested on the soft, thick grass with which the ground was carpeted, we deliberated as to the best means of erecting our house on the branches of one of the giant trees. As it was not likely we could get comfortably installed that night, I was somewhat anxious about our safety during the night which we should be forced to pass in the open air, exposed to the damp and quite unprotected against the attacks of wild animals. I called Fritz, believing him to be close at hand, to tell him it would be absolutely necessary for our safety to try and climb the largest tree. He did not answer, but 2 gunshots, one after the other, at some distance off, announced to us that he was not idle. He soon appeared, carrying by the hind legs a most beautiful tiger cat, which, as he advanced, he held up for our admiration. "Bravo, my young huntsman," I said. "You have really rendered a service to our feathered flock, in ridding them of such an enemy as that, which could follow them even to the tops of the trees. If you should see any more in our neighborhood, I entreat you to give them no quarter." "Why," said Ernest, "if God created the animals, he surely did so for some useful end, and I do not think we should declare against them such a merciless war." "It would be presumptuous," answered I, "to interrogate the Creator on the design of his works, but we are allowed to hazard some conjectures. I believe, then, that the animals which we call, no doubt wrongfully, destructive, have been created to maintain a certain equality between the creatures. Fritz will now tell us where and how he discovered this animal." "I found it quite near," answered the hunter. "I saw something moving amongst the leaves of a tree, and creeping noiselessly to the foot of it, I fired, and the animal fell at my feet. As I was going to take it up, I saw it move, so I dispatched it with my pistol. You may be glad it did not spring upon you when it was only wounded, for although those animals are small, they are very terrible when fighting for life. I can assure you, you have made a happy escape, all the more that I see that this is not an ordinary tiger cat, but a margay, a species common in South America and notorious for its fierceness and rapacity." "Whatever it may be," said Fritz, "look at the beautiful stains of black and brown on a gold ground. I hope that Jack will not cut up the skin of my margay as he did that of my jackal. Never fear, if you warn Jack, he will not meddle with it. But what do you intend to do with the skin?" "Nay, it is I who should ask you that," he answered. "I will follow your advice. I do not want to retain it for my sole use." "Well answered, my son. And now that we have no need for clothing, you can make cases of it in which to keep our table service, and you can have the tail for a hunting belt to hold your knife and pistols." "And I, father," asked Jack, "what shall I do with the skin of my porcupine?" "When we have taken out as many quills as we want for needles and for arrow points, I believe we could make the skin into a sort of cuirass for one of the dogs, to defend it in encounters with wild animals." "Oh, capital!" cried Jack. "I long to see Flora or Turk harnessed like that," and he gave me no rest till I set about skinning his porcupine. This I managed easily by tying the animal to a branch by its hind feet. Fritz watched my progress, doing the same with his margay. The 2 skins were afterwards nailed to a tree to dry. Part of the porcupine's flesh was cooked for our dinner, and the remainder was put aside to be salted. As Ernest was working by me, making a hearth with large stones, he asked if I did not think the trees under which we were magnolias. I said it was very probable, but I could not say positively without consulting the captain's library. "Ah, those dear books," said he. "When shall we be able to read and reread them at our leisure?" "Patience, my boy. Let us first see to matters that are indispensable. There are better days coming, I hope." Francis, whom his mother had commissioned to gather firewood, came back dragging some branches behind him and greedily eating some fruit he had found. "You foolish child!" cried his mother, running towards him. "How do you know that fruit is not poisonous? It might kill you. Show it to me." "Kill me," he repeated, terrified, putting out what he was just about to swallow. "Oh, no! I don't want to die, Mama!" Dropping the branches he carried, he pulled from his pocket 2 or 3 little figs and gave them to me. I was reassured, for I had never heard of any kind of figs being poisonous. I asked Francis where he had found them. "Just under one of those trees," he answered. "There are a great many more." I thought I might eat them when I saw the sow and the fowls devouring them in such numbers. "That is not a sufficient guarantee," I said, "for some fruits that are wholesome for animals are not so for man, and vice versa. The monkey, however, has a physical constitution resembling that of a man, and besides has a natural instinct about the nature of fruits. So I advise you always to consult it about anything of which you are in doubt." I had scarcely said so when Francis ran to the foot of a tree where the monkey was seated and offered it some of the figs with which his pockets were filled. The little animal took one in its hands, looked at it, smelt it, and then began to eat it. "Hurrah!" cried Francis, quite reassured, and again beginning to eat the fruit, which he very much liked. "Then these trees," said Ernest, "are fig trees?" "Yes," I replied, "but not dwarf trees like those that grow in our country. These belong rather, as you supposed, to the genus of the Mangolia, and to the species called the yellow Mangolia, whose roots, as you see here, form arches or vaults." Thus conversing, and while Francis helped his mother to prepare dinner, I tried to manufacture needles from the spikes of the porcupine. The point, of course, was already there. All I had to do was to make a hole in the other end, which I did with a red-hot nail. In a short time, I had an assortment of needles, of which our good housewife was very glad. The children, still astonished at the great height of the trees on which we proposed to erect our dwelling, set about trying to discover some way of climbing them. I was at first as much at a loss as they were. Still, after a little reflection, an idea struck me, but I determined to defer its execution. Our dinner being now ready, we seated ourselves in a circle. The porcupine's flesh and the soup made from it were both highly praised. For dessert, we had biscuit with Dutch cheese and butter. When we were sufficiently refreshed, I determined that we should be busy during the remaining hours of daylight. I asked my wife to make the leather straps which were necessary to yoke our beasts of burden to the pieces of timber to be brought from the shore. She immediately set to her task. The next thing to be done was to suspend our hammocks to the branches of the tree. Over them we spread sailcloth and fastened it in at the sides to protect us from the dew and mosquitoes. That done, Fritz, Ernest, and I went to the shore to search for pieces of wood, strong and straight enough to serve as steps to the rope ladder I had resolved to make. Ernest discovered on the borders of a small marsh a number of bamboos half buried in the mud. We pulled them out and cut them with a hatchet into lengths of 3 or 4 feet, putting them into 3 bundles, one for each. A short distance further on, and a little way into the marsh, I saw a tuft of reeds, towards which I went, intending to cut some for arrows. Flora, which was at my side, suddenly sprang forward, barking, when a whole troop of beautiful flamingos flew away with an amazing rapidity. Fritz, who seemed never to be taken by surprise, got ready his gun and fired before they were out of reach. 2 of them fell, one quite dead, the other only wounded in the wing. The wounded bird would probably have escaped if Flora had not pursued and seized it. The brave dog held it by the wing till I came up. When I brought my captive to the children, they were overjoyed and entreated that the bird might be kept alive and tamed. "How beautiful its bright red plumage will be among the other fowls," said Fritz. Ernest was astonished to see that the feet of the flamingo were equally well adapted for running or swimming, but I told him many other kinds of birds were as well off. I then cut some of the longest reeds, telling the boys as I did so that I wished by their aid to measure the exact height of the tree we were to inhabit. "Oh!" they cried incredulously. "You will need a great number to measure even to the beginning of the branches." "Have patience," I replied. "You have forgotten the lesson you learned from your mother's way of catching the fowls. Before pronouncing your opinion, you must see what I do." We returned loaded with the bamboos and reeds and the dead and living birds. Jack and Francis welcomed the flamingo with shouts of joy, but their mother looked grave when she saw another mouth added to the number of our domestic animals. Not at all alarmed on that score, I examined the poor bird's wounds. I saw that the extremities of both wings were fractured, the one by the shot and the other by Flora's teeth. I dressed them with a kind of ointment composed of butter, salt, and wine, and then tied it by the leg to a stake near the stream, where, left to itself, it put its head under its wing, and standing on one long leg, fell asleep. While I had been thus occupied, the children had tied a number of the reeds together and were trying to measure the height of one of the trees. They could hardly reach to where the branches joined the trunk, and I heard them again speak doubtfully of the success of my plan, which, however, I had not yet explained to them. Smiling at their incredulity, I proceeded to convert some of the canes into arrows by sharpening one end and garnishing the other with the feathers of the dead flamingo, using a flexible bamboo for a bow. Jack and Fritz had been watching the operation and now exclaimed, "Oh, a bow! A bow and arrows! Let me try it, Papa. You will see how expert I am." "Wait a moment," I said. "I have had all the trouble of making them, and I must have the honor of trying them first. I did not make them for play, however. I had an end in view, which I will show you immediately." I asked my wife if she could find me a clue of strong thread. "I will consult my magic bag," she said, smiling. "This is what you want, is it not?" she added, promptly satisfying my want. "It is no great mystery," said Jack, "to find in a bag what you put into it." "It is no mystery, certainly," I answered, "but it shows a presence of mind in your mother of which none of the rest of us were capable to remember in a moment of danger, such as that which preceded our departure from the vessel. So many small things, useful to us all." Now Jack had the best heart in the world, so, throwing himself into his mother's arms, he said, "I deserve to be sewed into your bag and never to be let out again." Unrolling the greater part of the clue, I tied one end of the thread to one of the arrows, which I shot up amongst the branches of the trees. The arrow passed over one of the branches, and, falling on the other side, left the thread resting on it. We easily ascertained by this means what height it would be necessary to make our ladder, deciding on 50 feet. Measuring then 100 feet of strong rope, and halving it, I stretched the two lengths parallel on the grass, and told Fritz to cut the bamboos into pieces 2 feet long. And these again Ernest and Jack helped me to fasten to the ropes by knots and nails to prevent them slipping. In less than an hour and a half, our ladder was completed, and to hoist it, the same means were used as I had employed to discover the height of the tree. I took another arrow and a triple cord to ensure its being strong enough. To the end of the cord we attached the ladder, which was soon securely fixed. Jack and Fritz disputed which should mount first. I gave the preference to Jack as being the lightest and as agile as a squirrel. I warned him to make sure of the strength of every step before venturing onto it, and to hurry down if he saw the least danger of the ladder giving way. He set off, paying very little heed to my warning, reached the first branch safely, and seating himself on it, shouted, "Victory! Victory!" Fritz mounted after him and fastened the ladder more securely when I followed them and examined the tree to decide on the best mode of erecting our dwelling. Night soon set in, and the last piece of work I did, namely fixing a strong pulley, preparatory to commencing operations on the following morning, had to be concluded by moonlight. I turned to descend and was surprised to find the boys had disappeared. I had just made up my mind they must have gone down, when I heard above me 2 clear young voices singing an evening hymn. I did not think it right to interrupt their song of praise, and their voices sounded so sweetly it seemed to me almost like the presage of a blessing on our new habitation. When they had finished, we all descended together, and my wife, who had meanwhile milked the cow and goat, set before us some milk and slices of the porcupine which remained from dinner. We tied the cattle for the night near our hammocks to the roots of our tree, and made a large fire of dry wood as a protection against beasts of prey. Our prayer offered, My wife and children went into their hammocks and slept soundly. I watched by the fire, kept wide awake during the first hours of the night by anxiety and starting at every slight noise I heard. But gradually I was overcome by fatigue and towards morning fell asleep, only awaking when all the rest of the family were astir.